Tonight's main story is about policing, as it's been a topic that has been in the news both in the US and Mexico quite frequently in the past year. The US has been gripped by the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. If you are not familiar with this case, Chauvin last summer put Minneapolis resident George Floyd into a chokehold after detaining him for trying to pay at a convenience store with a counterfeit $20 bill. It resulted in his death, which was witnessed by bystanders and filmed for millions of people to see. This sparked mass protests across the country about police brutality. Chauvin was charged with murder, but historically, police officers are usually found not guilty, especially if the victim is Black. But on Tuesday, the jury found him guilty of murdering George Floyd. The entire country breathed a huge sigh of relief. It was a historic ruling. Unfortunately, that outcome is rare. Early last week, a 20-year-old Black man named Dante Wright was shot by a police officer only miles away from where George Floyd was shot after being pulled over for having an air freshener hanging from his car's rear view mirror. The chief of the department has said she intended to draw her taser, but accidentally drew her gun instead, killing Wright. Yeah, compelling, right? She messed up and pulled her gun instead. These are just two instances of many encounters throughout history where police used excessive force on minorities that were not necessary, but probably used because of the color of their skin. We don't really hear anything about the treatment of immigrants from Mexico or Central America in the United States because there's even less advocacy, and because they're in the country illegally, they may have less rights. Because of the attacks on September 11th and the threat of terrorism, both international and domestic, police departments have been increasingly militarized, arming with tanks and gear you would only see in the movies.
The defense industry has become a major player in the domestic homeland security market, estimated to be worth over $20 billion in goods and services.
Flashbangs, tear gas, rubber bullets, helicopters, armored vehicles.
See, this is why some people want to defund the police, because they believe that too much policing is not always good. Others think it's ridiculous that more security keeps people safe, especially if something bad, really bad happens. But let's go over to Mexico, where in late March, police in Tulum tackled 36-year-old Salvadorian refugee Victoria Salazar to the ground and broke her spine, killing her in the process. It was caught on social media. Take a look. It brought to light the horrible treatment by police of another minority group, women, with an average of 10 women killed every day in 2020. And it's not just that the police are killing women, but don't take action when there are calls for help due to domestic abuse or other threats. Women took to the streets in recent years to protest this, vandalizing historical centers and monuments because they believed they needed to do something bold to give attention to this injustice that has existed for many years. It is argued that the police in Mexico are underfunded, that police officers are poorly trained and often only will take action if they are bribed to do so. My point is, maybe some of the issues are different, but the result is the same. Many people in the US and Mexico fear the police, especially if you are in a minority group. Even Americans in Mexico worry, like John Roberts here, an expat who has lived in Mexico for many years.
To be honest, guys, the only thing you have to actually worry about are the cops.
I knew that was coming.
The cops. That's it. I mean,
to talk more about this, we welcome Dr. David Pérez Esparza, Director of National Information Center in the National Public Security System, to the show. Dr. Perez, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Dr. Perez, my first question is if you're a woman, if you're poor, if you're indigenous, are you going to get treated differently by the police here in Mexico?
Yeah, absolutely. But it also depends where. I think Mexico is a very huge country, has a very complex dynamics. Organized crime behaves differently according to the state, according to the time, according to the type of crime, and police also behave differently. So It is about time, about space, and I think these are, as any other country, very important determinants about the risk of having a good relationship or not with the police.
Right. I understand. How is police brutality here? I mean, we saw the instance in Quintana Roo, and of course, we've been talking about in the U.S., it's been happening constantly. Do you feel that in Mexico, it's as big as a problem as it is in the U.S.?
I don't think so. I think police brutality actually is clearly a problem in Mexico, but I think it behaves differently than it does in the U.S. I think the problem in Mexico regarding police brutality is about some specific times, some specific settings. For instance, the relationship between organized crime groups and the police, it's very different than it happens in the US. And as I was mentioning before, it also depends of the state, for instance, what kind of organized crime group is basically operating there. So it has a different component. Also, the amount of guns that are available makes everything different. We don't have this situation that clear as in the US about the black population versus the white population. We have that, but it's a different way. I think the mestizo culture, I think, makes everything different in Mexico.
Sure.
You can probably see that concerning the indigenous groups and some other vulnerable groups, but I don't think it happens the same kind of brutality in Tulum, as you were mentioning, than probably in New Orleans or any other city that has a different component.
Right. Now, I know you're working on a program because after 2006, when the Calderon administration was in, they centralized police,
yeah.
right? They gave power to the federal police and took it away from the municipalities because of corruption.
Absolutely.
And that went through the Peña Nieto administration. Now it seems that in the AMLO administration, you're giving power back to the local police. Well,
yes.
Why is that happening?
Well, the national strategy of the current president, López Obrador, has two main doors, two main pillars. On the one hand, you have the National Guard, which is basically something that is new. It's similar to other strategies around the world, similar to what happened in Colombia, in Italy, probably in Chile, which is basically the use of armed force combined with civil service, and that's National Guards, no?
Right.
With other differences.
Which was the federal police, but transformed.
Basically transformed and with a very, very clear territorial component and focus. But on the other hand, you have a national police reform system, which in Spanish we call it Modelo Nacional de Policía, which has the main purpose of reforming the local police, basically the city police, which is basically 2,000 police, and the state police, which is basically 32 state police across the country.
Are you afraid that giving power back to the local police, corruption will increase again? Because I know that back in the day, the drug cartels that were in these local areas were working with the local police, and there was not order. Yeah. And there was a change there to try to maintain some kind of civil order inside these localities. Are you afraid that might happen again?
I mean, risk always exists. That's true. I mean, particularly when you talk about as a complicated in a complex setting, as with Mexico, you always have the risk of corruption. And I think you have to be aware of that. When you design or when you implement policies, you have to be aware of the risk. Fortunately, we have systems and strategies and programs that help us to mitigate those risks. We have Control de Confianza, which is basically this set of techniques that are basically designed to focus on people who might be more vulnerable for corruption or to corruption. No? But I think that's not the real problem in Mexico. Now, you talk about as a main focus on the police institution is about capabilities, about resources, and I think that's probably equally important as corruption sometimes, and probably is correlated with corruption. You know?
Right.
So I wouldn't say it's a massive risk. You have to take into account, you have to mitigate it, understand it, but I don't think that is a most important problem.
I understand, but sometimes I think that if police officers in Mexico City are making on average of 13,000 pesos a month, which is about $560 US, don't you think there's some incentive for the police to make corruption and to take bribes? Because it doesn't seem like $550 a month is a livable wage.
No, it is not. It is not. And I think it's important to make it clear. One of the key points, the key goals of this strategy is to make the police forces as a top priority, and this implies identifying that salaries, identifying that equipment and information are key strategies to make police decent, humans. And I think it's something that probably sounds like a very obvious from Western rich country perspective. But when you talk about Mexico, you have to consider that police is basically the last resource you have for working in a decent place. It's clearly the opposite of the best place to work so far.
Right.
And I think we want to change that. We want to change that. We want to change the conditions, the human conditions. We want to make people happy working in the police, and that implies a massive structural reform from its very foundational keys.
Absolutely. Let's switch gears a little bit because you're in charge of information and statistics.
Absolutely.
And I know that sometimes what the media reports is different than what's happening. What do you think the biggest disconnect is between what's really happening in your statistics and what the media is saying about safety in the country?
Well, I think you have to take into account that for media, scandals are business.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it happens here, it happens in the UK, it happens in Africa, it happens in Asia. When you understand that for media, for someone who works in the media, the scandal, the crisis, this is basically what makes it money.
Right.
And that's something normal of democracies. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of that. It's something normal. It happens in the US, it happens in this case of Floyd. But in the case of Mexico, I think media, in academia, in society, we should be more prepared to use data in a very smart way to understand what's going on really. For instance, in the case of Mexico, homicide has been reducing during this year, and it has been reducing since AMLO is in power. But I'm very confident to say that not everyone in the country assumes that.
Right.
I would say that probably no one actually knows that.
No, I definitely didn't think that. I thought it was on the rise.
No,
you hear
it
all
was
these
on the
mass
rise.
graves that are
Yeah.
being found.
I mean, and this is clearly a huge problem. And
Right.
I think we cannot deny that. But I mean, if I tell you that homicide reduces 4% this year compared to the last year, it's something that no one knows in Mexico. So
of course, the narcos were in quarantine too, right?
That's
That's a
true.
thing that
Yeah,
happened,
that's-
right?
yeah,
You know, with cubrebocas and everything.
absolutely. Yeah, at the end of the day, you have to understand that COVID actually makes a difference.
Mm.
But most of the crime, for instance, car theft and other crimes, started to reduce before COVID.
Okay.
So I think it's related, and I think we need more evidence, we need more data to actually understand what's the role of COVID in crime. Most
Right.
people, I don't know if you remember, when Mexico, at least when we have this debate and COVID started, people say, oh, with COVID, it's going to be a massive crisis. Everyone's going to be killing each other for food. And you don't see that either.
Yeah. Well,
So-
I mean, my kitchen is stacked with soups and
And
pretzels.
you don't feel threat. You
Yeah,
don't
I
feel
never had to
particularly
use
threat.
them. No, and it's interesting that you're saying that because a lot of Americans are thinking that Mexico is crime infested because you have a small killing in Puebla,
Mhm.
and then a woman from Topeka, Kansas is scared to send her daughter to Cancun, right?
Mhm.
I mean, these are the disconnect that
It's a massive
happens.
country. It's a massive country.
Right.
It's the size of Europe.
Yep.
You have to consider that. I mean, Chihuahua is the size of Germany.
Yep.
So when you understand that and you put this in perspective, you see that Mexico is a large country, it's a highly populated country. 127 million people live here.
Right.
You have cities such as Mexico City, such as Monterrey, such as Guadalajara. You have rural areas in Michoacán. You have the coast in Acapulco. You have Cancun. And all of this is Mexico. And it's the same in the US. But
Yeah, I would
sometimes-
say so if someone gets killed in Newark, you know, you're not going to be scared to go to
Arkansas
Topeka,
or
Kansas,
whatever.
right?
Yeah.
But I have time for one more question. Tell us one statistic that you've seen that would be very surprising to us. That's something really interesting for us.
Probably more than statistics, I will make a comparison and say that some places in the US, in the southeast and southwest particularly, some places in Louisiana, for instance, are much more dangerous than the average Mexican town.
Okay. Well, Dr. Perez, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you
Dr.
for the invitation.
David Pérez Esparza, the head of the National Information Center. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.